Welcome to Pacific States University's online lecture series for Gen 108, Explorations in the Arts. Today, we are diving into the radical transformation of modern art, tracing the journey from the minimalist pursuit of absolute truth to the vibrant chaos of the contemporary global canvas. Now, to kick things off, I want you to just close your eyes for a second and picture a plain, unpainted, factory-made aluminum box. That's it. No expressive brushstrokes, no deep hidden meaning, no emotional turmoil poured out by a tortured artist. Just a simple metal box. If you had stumbled across something like this in a high-end gallery back in 1950, you honestly might have asked the janitor if someone forgot to clean up after a construction project. But by the mid-1960s, objects exactly like this were triggering an absolute revolution in the art world. You see, for centuries, art was essentially a window. It asked you to look through the frame into another world, maybe a lush landscape, a holy figure, or a dramatic battle scene. But then, a totally new generation of artists arrived on the scene, and they asked a pretty radical question. What if art stopped trying to be a window? What if instead, art became a mirror? So, here is our roadmap for today's session. We've got 6 key phases to cover. First, cleaning the canvas. Second, leaving the canvas behind. Third, the ultimate disappearance. Fourth, the age of irony. Fifth, the return of raw emotion. And finally, the global playground. We're charting a chronological journey here, so let's jump right in.
Section 1. Cleaning the canvas. The late 1950s.
To really understand how we eventually got to that plain aluminum box I mentioned, we actually have to start back on the traditional canvas. In the late 1950s, a major rebellion was brewing in the studios. Artists were looking at the messy, chaotic, deeply emotional brushstrokes of the abstract expressionists, think of the wild splatters of Jackson Pollock, and they basically said, okay, enough of that. They craved clarity. They wanted absolute precision. This shift gave birth to what we call hard-edge painting. Ellsworth Kelly is probably our prime example here. Kelly looked at the world in a totally different way than his predecessors. If he was looking at a bridge, he didn't want to paint the bridge itself. He wanted to paint the pure, isolated shape of the shadow that the bridge cast. He'd take these shapes from reality and put them on the canvas with razor-sharp precision. There are absolutely no fuzzy boundaries in his work. The color doesn't slowly romantically fade out. It stops perfectly where the next massive block of flat color begins. It's incredibly striking to see in person.
And this brings us to a quote that brilliantly captures the entire ethos of this era, courtesy of a very young Frank Stella. In 1959, Stella completely rocked the art world with a series of revolutionary pieces known as his black paintings. Imagine these massive canvases covered in precise, rhythmic black stripes, separated only by thin lines of raw, unpainted canvas. People would walk into the gallery, scratch their heads, and immediately start looking for a hidden message. They'd ask, what does the black represent? Is it death? Is it grief? Is it the anxiety of the Cold War? Stella liberated the canvas, and really the viewer, with this famous mantra, what you see is what you see. Think about how incredibly freeing that is. The painting isn't trying to trick you. There's no secret code to crack. By totally flattening the surface, artists like Stella and Kelly proved that pure color and geometry alone could hold your attention, completely unfiltered.
Section 2. Leaving the canvas behind, the 1960s and 70s.
Okay, so once the canvas was completely flattened out, the next logical step was actually quite terrifying for traditionalists. Stepping off that flat wall entirely and bringing that pure geometry right into the three-dimensional room with you. Welcome to the 1960s and 70s, an era totally dominated by minimalism. Enter Donald Judd. Now, Judd actually hated the word minimalism. He strongly preferred to call his works specific objects. And the absolutely crucial point here is that Judd didn't use a paintbrush. He didn't even use a chisel or a welding torch. He drew up precise blueprints and sent them off to industrial ironworks and plastics factories. Imagine a gallery wall with a vertical line of completely identical, factory-made stainless steel and plexiglass boxes stacked one above the other. By utilizing industrial manufacturing, Judd completely stripped away what we call the hand of the artist. He eliminated the artist's ego from the work. He didn't want you marveling at his craftsmanship. He wanted you to focus entirely on how the light bounces off that cold steel and how this physical object alters the space of the room you're both sharing.
Now, while Judd was busy playing with industrial steel, another artist, Dan Flavin, was playing with pure light. Flavin literally went down to the local hardware store, bought standard, commercial fluorescent light tubes, and fastened them directly to gallery walls. It sounds almost absurdly simple, right? But when you stand in front of a Dan Flavin piece, the art isn't just the physical glass tube and the metal casing. The art is the brightly colored light bleeding into the corner of the room and literally bathing your skin. This is a huge takeaway for us. minimalism was never about a lack of substance. It was actually about an abundance of presence. It forces you, the viewer, to exist entirely and completely in the present moment.
Section 3. The Ultimate Disappearance, the Late 60s.
Which brings us to a really fascinating philosophical question for the class. If you strip away the emotion, the brushstrokes, the craftsmanship, and then you strip away even the physical substance itself, what exactly is left? Well, by the late 1960s, a new group of artistic radicals decided that the minimalists, with their steel boxes and light tubes, were still way too focused on physical objects. So they initiated what I like to call the ultimate disappearance. This was the birth of conceptual art. The core philosophy here is simple but profound: ideas over objects. The physical artwork is seen as nothing more than a souvenir. The true art, the actual masterpiece, happens entirely in the mind of the viewer. Suddenly, art isn't just a matter of aesthetics or looking at something pretty anymore. It becomes a matter of deep philosophy and active inquiry.
Let's unpack Joseph Kosuth's conceptual masterpiece to really wrap our heads around this. He created a piece called 1 and 3 Chairs. Picture this: sitting in a gallery is a real, physical wooden chair. Right next to it on the wall is a life-sized photograph of that exact chair. And right next to that is a blown-up, printed dictionary definition of the word chair. Kosuth is essentially pointing at this display and asking us a profound question. Which one is the real chair? Is it the wooden object you can actually sit on? Is it the visual representation in the photograph? Or is it the linguistic concept printed on the wall? The genius of this piece is that the artwork isn't any single one of these items. The artwork is the mental friction you experience in your brain while trying to answer the question. It's brilliant.
And then, pushing this even further, we have Saul LeWitt. LeWitt fundamentally believed that the physical execution of a piece of art, the actual drawing or painting part, was just a mechanical chore. He created what he called wall drawings, but he didn't actually draw them. He wrote them out as sets of typed instructions, almost like a recipe or computer code. He'd sell these instructions to a museum. The museum staff would spend weeks executing the drawing on the wall, and here's the kicker. When the exhibit ended, they would literally paint over it with white paint. The physical art was destroyed, completely gone, but the artwork itself survived perfectly intact. Why? Because the idea was reproducible. By doing this, LeWitt totally democratized art. He proved it could be immortal, reproducible, and completely free from the confines of a physical frame.
Now, as we move across our historical timeline from the 60s and 70s into the 1980s, we hit what I call the Great Transition. By the late 1970s, the art world had essentially achieved this state of pure, silent, philosophical ideas. But let's be real for a second. Human beings don't live in quiet, sterile, purely intellectual white cubes. Outside the walls of the museum, the real world was becoming hyper-commercialized. It was being flooded with television, massive billboards, mass media, and nonstop advertising. That clean minimalist mirror we've been talking about, it was trying desperately to ignore the loud chaos of everyday human culture. So a brand new generation of artists came along and said, nope. They finally fractured that perfect mirror, ushering in the loud, completely messy reality of the 1980s.
Section 4. The Age of Irony, from the 1970s to the 1990s.
Welcome to Postmodernism. This is a massive era born from a generation of artists who looked at those pristine, factory-made boxes of minimalism and decided they were entirely too pure, too silent, and honestly, a bit too elitist for the loud reality of modern life. They completely abandoned the search for a singular, absolute truth. We can see a really vital contrast here. Modernism, which encompasses the minimalists we just talked about, was all about sincerity, purity, and a drive for total originality. Postmodernism, on the other hand, is all about irony, appropriation, and exploring identity. Instead of stripping things away to find some hidden purity, postmodern artists began wildly grabbing everything they could from everyday consumer culture. They started remixing, questioning, and playfully subverting a world that felt like it was made up of endless copies.
A perfect example of this is Cindy Sherman's incredible cinematic photography. She created a famous series called Untitled Film Stills. When you look at one of these photos, say a shot of a young woman in a sharp 1950s suit looking anxiously off camera, it looks exactly like a still from a classic Hitchcock film, right? Your brain immediately starts guessing the plot of the movie. But here's the twist. There is no movie. Every single one of these images is a self-portrait. Sherman acted as the photographer, the lighting tech, the director, the wardrobe designer, and the star. She completely mastered the art of appropriation, using these incredibly familiar visual tropes to ask us a brilliant, slightly unsettling question.
How much of our own identity is truly original, and how much of it is just a script handed to us by mass media, magazines, and Hollywood? Are we just playing parts? While Sherman was brilliantly questioning human identity, an artist named Jeff Koons was using media to question our concepts of high art and taste. Koons took an everyday, totally low-culture item, literally a cheap plastic balloon dog you'd get at a kid's birthday party, and he recreated it on a monumental, incredibly expensive scale out of mirror-polished stainless steel. It is hyper-glossy, massively heavy, and utterly devoid of any deep, emotional, artistic meaning. And that's exactly the point. It's the ultimate irony. Koons forces us to confront our own obsession with glossy consumer culture by literally holding up a giant, shiny, 10-foot-tall mirror to it.
Section 5. The Return of Raw Emotion, the Early 1980s.
Now, as you might intuitively guess, human beings can really only survive on a diet of cold irony and highly polished surfaces for so long. Eventually, there was going to be a massive backlash. Artists started to crave feeling something visceral, something raw and real again. They wanted to put the bleeding soul back into art. This sparked an era known as Neo-Expressionism, the return of raw emotion. Let's look at Jean-Michel Basquiat to see exactly how this builds. Starting out as a gritty, underground graffiti artist in New York City under the tag Samo, Basquiat brought this raw, frantic, pulsing inner-city energy straight into the sterile, high art gallery world. His paintings are essentially a form of explosive visual jazz. He completely threw out the neat, clean intellectual puzzles of the 1970s and replaced them with unadulterated passion. You look at his canvases filled with skulls, crowns, and frantically crossed-out words, and you're seeing urgent, visceral cries that address deep issues of racism, history, and street life.
At the exact same time, Julian Schnabel was taking this aggression and literally breaking artistic boundaries with it. Schnabel would take massive, heavy canvases, glue thousands of shattered ceramic plates all over them, and then aggressively paint right over the jagged, completely uneven surface. These works are heavy, they are physically imposing, and visually violent. Through this sheer physical force, Schnabel proved to the critics that painting wasn't dead at all. It just needed to break a few things and bleed a little bit to remind us of its incredible power.
Section 6. The Global Playground, 1980s onward.
This brings our lecture squarely into the present day. If the previous movements we've discussed were heavily centered in New York or Paris, contemporary art from the 1980s onward has absolutely no single style and no single geographic center. It has blossomed into a deeply diverse, endlessly multimedia global playground. Take, for example, the worldwide phenomenon of Yayoi Kusama. Kusama managed to turn her own deep, personal, psychological hallucinations into an absolute artistic empire. She shifted the entire paradigm of how we experience art. Instead of just standing back and looking at a piece of art on a wall, she completely immerses you in it. Her infinity mirror rooms are spaces filled with mirrors, water, and thousands of glowing LEDs. By inviting us to literally step inside these infinite glowing reflections of her own mind, she speaks to a deeply universal human desire for endless connection and awe.
Meanwhile, over in the UK, Damien Hirst was providing a profoundly shocking challenge to our fundamental ideas of life and death. Hirst created a piece featuring an actual 14-foot tiger shark preserved perfectly in a massive glass tank of formaldehyde. He forces viewers to step up and stand face-to-face with a frozen apex predator. It is terrifying, it is bizarrely beautiful, and it is deeply conceptual. It demands that the viewer stop and confront their own physical mortality in real time, right there in the middle of a gallery space.
And finally, to close out our historical examples, we have to look at the powerful activist art of Ai Weiwei. Imagine walking into the massive turbine hall of the Tate Modern Museum and seeing the floor completely covered in 100 million sunflower seeds. Now, step closer. Every single one of those 100 million seeds was individually handcrafted and hand-painted out of porcelain by traditional artisans in China. Think about the sheer, staggering scale of that labor. It is a profound, incredibly moving commentary on mass production, geopolitical power, and the value of the individual versus the masses. Weiwei demonstrates perfectly how contemporary art operates today, not just as something beautiful to look at, but as a profound, global conversation about human rights and political reality. Art, here, is a vital political weapon. So let's bring this all together. As we've seen today, the bold artists of the minimalist era broke the old traditional rules of the canvas to show us the silent beauty of pure absolute truth. But the artists who followed, they broke those rules. They boldly fractured that clean, minimalist mirror so that art could finally reflect the full, unrestricted, wonderfully messy complexity of human existence. In those millions of shattered, overlapping pieces today, we no longer look for one single dictatorial truth. Instead, we look into the fragments to understand different cultures, completely different identities, and our own incredibly complex world. So as you go out into that world, I leave you with this question. In a shattered mirror, how will art reflect your world? Thank you all so much for joining this session of Explorations in the Arts, and I will see you in our next lecture.